Hello all, and today we'll be going over the history of the 1st Infantry Regiment of Arkansas Volunteers that fought for the Union Army during the American Civil War. The first Arkansas story would start in November of 1863, when the Army gave authority to James Johnson of Huntsville to organize a regiment of infantrymen made up of loyal Arkansans. All the men would come from northwest Arkansas, and they would eventually be mustered along with the help of Elhanan Searle, who was a officer in the 10th Illinois Cavalry, and they would eventually be mustered on March 25th of 1863. However, they were really they barely could be called a regiment. In April of 1863, they would have their first battle, and many were without uniforms or proper equipment, so they didn't even have this. So for their first battle, only about 5 companies participated, while the rest were put out of harm's way. But they did good. They didn't run at the artillery, and many would be their first experience with battle, aside from a few which we'll get into later. But all in all, they were successful in their first battle, along with the 1st Arkansas U.S. Cavalry. And the remainder of the year, it was mostly quiet until they were and they were attached to General Blunt. He went into Indian Territory, pursuing the Confederates, where the regiment would have a minor skirmish at Perryville. Blunt eventually turned his attention to Fort Smith, and while he ordered some of the regiments to continue after the Confederates, him, along with the 1st Arkansas, were to capture Fort Smith on September 1st. They were the first Union regiment to enter it after it being abandoned by the federal government. And following that month, you would have the Battle of Hagwood Prairie. Now, this would occur because Unionists were hiding out all over northwest Arkansas, and the 1st Arkansas was ordered to provide ammunition to some of these men. They were hiding out in Mount Magazine, and they were successful. And on their return back, however, they were surprised along with the Confederates. So the two of them did a minor skirmish. The numbers vary from 200 1st Arkansas to 50, but all in all, they were outnumbered essentially. But they did despite this, 2 hours they skirmished with them. They suffered 2 killed, 10 wounded, and many were captured by them until they eventually had to retreat and fall back to Fort Smith. And that would really be, the rest of the year would be quiet. They would scout in northwest Arkansas, and really just minor skirmishes, in Newton County and areas like that, until the Red River Campaign began. And part of that was the Camden Expedition, and they were part of General Thayer's Frontier Division. They were under the 1st Brigade, and they would leave in March to go down to Camden. And their first battle of the expedition would be at Moscow, or Prairie du Chien, depending on who whatever. If you consider Prairie du Chien to be separate, then they didn't fight at Prairie du Chien. But if you consider it to be Moscow to be the same, then they did. But they suffered 3 killed and many wounded. And the second would be at Jenkins Ferry. Now, at this, the 1st Arkansas were reported to go up, along with the 12th Kansas, to shore up the Confederates' left, or the Union's left flank. And they did this. They didn't, according to Major Johnson of Company A or B, I believe, he said the company had repulsed a strong flanking party without losing any men itself. But Stream's really lucky when you look at all the other numbers from the Union regiments who were at the battle. But after they were successful, and they were to retreat back to Little Rock. along the way, their company flag or their regimental flag looked like it was about to be destroyed, but a man named Pete, he had taken it and wrapped it around and carried it all the way back to Little Rock. So good fortune there. And for the remainder of the year, again, just minor skirmishes, scouting missions, guard duties, things of that nature. And eventually they would be mustered out in August 10th, 1865. Uh, and, and I said, no, the men who made up the 1st Arkansas came from a wide array. They were farmers, townsfolk, but some of the men actually used to be Confederate conscripts. Michael Hoppers is one example, who he fought for the Confederates during the Battle of Prairie Grove. He later deserted, but there is documentation of men in the 1st Arkansas who had fought for the Confederacy, either as a volunteer who later deserted or a conscript. Some of these men would later have a little bit of difficulty receiving their pension, but I think the majority of them were successful in obtaining one. And that's really about it for the 1st Arkansas Infantry Regiment. Not a famous regiment. The 1st Arkansas Cavalry, that's a much more well-known Arkansas Unionist regiment. But I just thought it was an interesting story about the men who, despite their state leaving, they decided to join. And not just Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, they all had Unionist regiments despite being a Confederate state. And Arkansas would provide the second most Unionist men, the first being Tennessee, of course. But that's about it for their history, just men from Northwest Arkansas who wanted to fight for the Union or just didn't have any other choice, as many of their families would become harassed by the Confederate sympathizers, bushwhacking, jayhawkers, that sort of thing. It was really hard to live at that time in Northwest Arkansas. And many joined. All in all, their service, they did good for the Union and their state. So that's basically the story of the 1st Arkansas. If you want to know more, the Wikipedia page, I do a lot of edits to that, the 1st Arkansas's Wikipedia page, and I may make a video on the 1st Arkansas Cavalry. There's a whole lot more information about them, but that's about it.